There, my name's Gabriel Seltzer. I'm a member of Dice3D, Brandeis University's 3D printing club, and I'm lucky enough to have been messing around a lot with Simplify3D, and so I thought I'd give you guys a quick overview of my process for printing when it comes to everything from importing the model in Simplify3D and then exporting it onto an SD card to print later with. This is just kind of a general overview, a little bit more in depth than my last video, which was how to use Simplify3D if you're used to using MakerBot, because I'll go over a few more settings, but I still won't go over all of them. If you need to know about those other settings, then you can either go to the Simplify3D website, also contact their support, their support is fantastic, and may look for another video that I've done at some time in the future, if it's been a while since this one. Hopefully I'll do one that goes over every single setting that you need to know in order to print or set up a new printer. I should also mention that this is for Simplify3D version 2.2.2, so if it's been a while since this video came out, things may have moved around. You may not find settings where they used to be, and so things will be slightly different. Hopefully I'll have put out another new video to explain the changes and whatever like that. To get started though, I've got my view of where my model would be right here, and the footprint of where my build plate is. To rotate this view, you can use the left mouse button. To pan the view, you can use the right mouse button. And to reset it, you can press the middle mouse button. And to zoom, you can scroll the scroll wheel. There's also some buttons off to the side here that'll give you top and bottom views and such like that. But it's to your personal preference of how to manipulate that camera. So let's get a model on here so we can start printing. All the models are listed right here. So right now, of course, I have none in this box. But in order to bring one in, I'll say import here. I'll pick up this model right here, which is the yearbeast.stl. It's actually from my Thingiverse page, March 113. If you're interested in downloading this particular one, it's a bit of a complex model for your first print, so I wouldn't really recommend it. But it'll give us all of the particular settings that we might have to go through for a complicated print like this. And also, it's one of my favorite Dota 2 models from the game, so all credit to them for the actual model. So you can see now it got dropped onto the build plate once I said OK to open it, and I can see that it fits nicely onto this build plate. Now I should mention though that I'm going to pretend that I'm using the MakerBot Replicator 2 because it's a fantastic printer, but that this is not actually the correct build size or the build plate size for the MakerBot Replicator 2. I actually just sliced a file for the Type A Machines Series 1 printer. Which is massive and really, really nice to print with, but it's larger than the MakerBot Replicator 2. So the build plate size is wrong for this. To fix this, we'll have to actually tell the Simplify3D what program or what printer I want to use. So all of those settings are saved under the processes settings here. That contains everything for your particular print and everything that has to do with your printer itself. So a lot of them you'll only have to ever mess with the first time you set up a printer, or if you're doing serious high-level tweaks. So as I said before, I'm not going to show you all of those settings, but know that if there's a lot there and it seems overwhelming, that we can kind of fix that by just ignoring a lot of those things. Hopefully you don't need to deal with them. So let's get right into it. So the processes will be listed here just like the models, and you can either double-click a process or click this Edit Process Settings button to go to the processes settings. If there's none there, you can just press the Add button there. As you can see, this is actually the advanced view I mentioned, I forgot to mention in my last video. So your view may look like this instead, which only has a few buttons here. To get to my view that I'm going to be using for this video, you just click this Show Advanced button and you'll get all of the nice settings. Now to select what printer you want to use, or what profile technically, which typically saves all the things for a printer, you'll go here and you'll select whichever printer you want to use. Usually you'll pick one of the defaults. I'm using, as I said, for the MakerBot Replicator 2. I have my own preset. The default one that comes with Simplify3D is called MakerBot Replicator 2, but I renamed mine as Replicator 2 Optimal just because that's the way I roll. So I'll click this, and it'll ask me if I want to export any changes I made to my current profile. Depending on whoever was using your software last, this may or may not pop up, but I'm going to say no, I don't care about the settings I was just using. And now I'll get all the settings I have loaded for my new MakerBot Replicator 2. I should also mention, though, that there are these dots up here, the auto configure for print quality material. As of right now, they work pretty well in the default settings, but they don't work very well. They're hard to set yourself when you come up with better defaults for materials or print quality. So I'm not going to go over them here. Hopefully, eventually, they'll become easier to fiddle with. But for now, let's ignore them. But if you see now that if I click the OK button down here, it'll resize my build plate to have my Year Beast actually off the build plate. So if I tried to print this would cause a lot of problems. But this is the proper size for the MakerBot Replicator 2, and I can click the center and arrange button right here to put him back on the build plate, touching the build plate, all those nice things, so that we wouldn't have a problem if we did want to put him. Now I know that, because I sliced this guy before, that he will actually fit perfectly onto the build plate. It's about maximum size, but you might need to do some tweaking for that. So to make sure that you have your print oriented correctly, you can either double click on the print or double click on the model up here. I'm going to double click on the print, and it'll give you the model settings thing. Now you can change the model name here, you can move it around. You can, with these buttons here, you can scale it like this. You can rotate it like this, and all sorts of weird things. But assuming you don't want to print a Year Beast upside down, I'm going to send him back to the normal scale, press save, and center arrange him. Oh, I forgot to flip him back. Let's do that real quick. There we go. Now he's still upside down again, so put him back on the build plate. Perfect. So now I have the properly scaled Year Beast. You may need to fiddle with it. Actually, if you import a small model, it'll ask you if you want to scale it up, because it might ask you if you designed it in inches versus the millimeters, then your model will be really, really small. But for now, you shouldn't really have to worry about that. This is just how I'm going to have my model oriented. So going back to the printer settings, this extruder tab on the front is mostly stuff that you have to set up the first time you have a printer running. So most of this should be good. If you're running one of the default profiles, you will not need to mess with this. The only thing that I will call your attention to is the extrusion multiplier right here. If you've done printing before with your printer and Simplify3D and you're a little bit confused as to why you might be pushing too much plastic out of your nozzle or too little plastic, either over extruding or under extruding, and you don't know how to mess with all the other settings, this is a nice quick fix to just change the multiplier for all extrusion movements. So everything that you move, it'll quickly change that multiplier from whatever it normally is to maybe 1.2 times what Simplify would normally think that it should be. So, for example, all my tool movements are going to tell the printer to push out 1.15 times the amount of filament that they normally would have. I've just found that that's pretty optimal for my particular MakerBot Replicator 2. It may vary even if you have the same exact printer that I do, or same model. So that's something you may need to feel out. So that's just a good, quick little hot fix if you're having problems with your printer. But everything else here is not something you really need to mess with for the most part. I'll move right along into the Layer tab. Layer tab does have a lot of settings that are worth messing with. So if you're using a dual extrusion printer, you'll have this primary extruder here, or whatever you called your first extruder, and you'll see a list of a couple of others. So make sure that if you want to print on the correct nozzle, that you'll click this and select which other nozzle you want to be the one to be printing with. I'm not going to go over dual extrusion right now because that's a lot more complicated. Most people don't have dual extrusion printers. But moving right along, primary layer height is one of the most important things to take stock of when you're starting to slice a print. This is basically the quality level, how thick each layer is going to be. The higher the layer height, the less layers you're going to need, and so the faster your print will go, but it'll also look a lot worse. And printers typically have a maximum amount of filament that they can push at any given time because they can't heat up filament that fast. And so if you make it too high, then your extruder will start to skip, the drive gear will start to skip, and you won't be able to push out filament, and your prints will look totally nasty. So 0.2 millimeters or 200 microns is typically a pretty good midpoint for having relatively good quality while also going pretty fast. High quality for me is usually 0.1 millimeters, and low quality is usually around 0.3 millimeters. So I'm just going to leave this as is. Depending on what printer you're using, what kind of nozzle or the nozzle size you have, you may change it or leave it at whatever the default is here. But for changing quality, this is usually what you would edit. As far as other important things here, top solid layers and bottom layers is pretty nice. I usually like to have 3 layers of each, which is about 0.6 millimeters of filament on the top and the bottom that's completely solid. That way the top and the bottom of your print look good instead of being able to see the infill pattern through them. If you lower the primary layer height to say 0.1, then you do need to double the number of top and bottom layers because you'll have only 0.3 millimeters of top and bottom solid bits. I usually, even when I'm printing at 0.1, I like to bump up these numbers to 10, just to be safe that everything is going to look good. Because usually having a 0.1 print, I care about how good it looks, and I care that it's going to take a long time, and a long time to reprint. But 3 is usually my default for these. As far as outline and perimeters, again, something you might need to change if you're doing something that you cared about the strength of or how fast. 2 is usually good in case one of them messed up. The other one will still look good, which is why you draw them from the inside out. So the outside one, which hopefully will look, if the inside one messes up, the outside one will still look good, and that's the one you'll see when the print is done. 2 is usually good. 1 is fine for things if you care if they're going really fast. And 3 is typically pretty good if you care if they're strong. You can make that even more. Moving right along, the first layer settings. This is another very common thing to have to tweak. Adhesion of the first layer, making sure it sticks to the build plate, is a huge problem across any printer. And if your first layer doesn't stick, the rest of your print is going to fail. So making sure that that works out really nicely is very, very important. And fortunately, Simplify3D has a lot of settings to make sure that that can happen. First layer height means how much as a modifier of your normal layer height is going to be for your first layer. So if I do 110%, that's 1.1 times whatever my normal layer height is for the first layer. That'll raise the nozzle a little bit further off the build plate, and it'll push more filament to compensate. It is kind of still, I don't know personally perfectly if it's better to push more or less filament given a particular print. For the first layer, I usually have pretty good success doing a tiny bit more filament, but for example, this would be really useful if I changed my primary layer height to 0.1. Then if I changed the first layer to 200%, then that would be like I was printing the first layer at 0.2. And if all my other settings for the first layer work really well for when I'm printing 0.2, then I won't have to change them. The first layer will be 0.2 and the rest will be 0.1, so the whole print except for the first layer will look great, but honestly it's not a huge deal. So that's a nice way of getting around having to deal with changing your first layer settings whenever you change your primary layer height. It's just tweaking this setting right here. First layer width is for each travel across the build plate. You can have the first layer be a little bit wider, so it pushes more filament and perhaps moves slower. That way it kind of squishes out further, has more surface area on the build plate to stick to, and hopefully you'll have less adhesion issues. I haven't messed with this too much, but it should work really well. I've heard good things about it. First layer speed is really the most important of these settings. You don't want the first layer to be going as fast as your rest of your print, just because going slower makes it a lot simpler to fix adhesion issues. You can see them happening, and hopefully you won't have any issues with going too fast. So I usually like to have this when I'm printing on blue tape, somewhere around 30%, perhaps even lower, depending on your particular printer. That's something you'll want to be tweaking a lot, and the first thing really I would go to if I had adhesion issues with the first layer. The rest of the stuff here you could take a look at, but is not particularly important for your first couple of prints. So I'll move right along onto the Additions tab. So this is two pretty useful settings here, the skirt and brim and raft. If you know much about 3D printing, you might know a raft is included to make sure that stuff sticks even better to the first layer of your print sticks even better to the build plate. It's kind of a really thick first layer that you'll be pulling off beforehand when your print is done. This is kind of ugly and you don't want it, but it moves super slow and super thick, so that if you had an important print you didn't want to pop off the build plate, or something that didn't have a lot of surface area and weren't sure if it was going to stick to the build plate well, you typically turn on a raft. It can be really useful also for unattended prints, because you really don't want those to pop up or else your printer will explode, which has happened sometimes at Dice 3D, not fun. So turning on a raft will also give you access to these other settings. For the most part, you don't need to mess with them. I found that it can be somewhat difficult to take a raft off, so messing with them after you have trouble with that to try and get better results is something you may have to do personally. You may also notice that there's an Include Raft Here button. It's the same thing as this one, just a little bit more easily accessible. For skirt, I usually like to turn that on. Basically, that's just a couple lines that it draws on the first layer before starting your actual print, so you can make sure that the nozzle isn't clogged, filament's coming out alright, the build plate's level, all sorts of things before you start getting to the real print. You can make any appropriate tweaks that you might need to do. If you set the offset to 0, you'll get a brim where the skirt actually touches the print. And that can be kind of like a poor man's raft. It'll help with adhesion, but it's a little bit easier to take off than a raft. You can mess with your preferences for that. But it's nice to know what each of these does. Moving right along into infill, you should probably know that infill is what happens when you print the interior of your print. Typically, we don't like to 3D print things that are solid, so we have a kind of a crosshatch pattern in the middle to keep them strong, but have them go faster, save filament, which is saving money. The infill percentage is the same thing as the slider up here. Since Simplify3D does rectilinear or draws squares in the inside of your print, I like to print with maybe 10, 15, 20% infill. If you care about strength, you would probably bump that up 30, 40, or 50 even. You could find other guides for more specifics on that, but I'm just going to stick with 10%. The rest of these settings are more stuff that you'll need to mess with some other time, depending on your particular, very specific for your print. But you don't need to worry about them for the most part. Moving right along again is supports. So for my particular print, this Yearbeast guy, anything that's not touching the build plate and isn't connected by an overhang angle of, say, 45 degrees, typically needs supports, especially stuff that's supposed to be printing directly in midair. So if you can see this tail part right here, it's going to be printing on nothing but thin air. So that typically needs a support. So I'll click Generate Support Material. That's also over here. This button, the same button again. And I'll go into a little bit more specifics on how to use supports, but in general, most of these settings you don't need to mess with, because we're going to be using not automatic, but manual support generation, because that's one of the best parts of Simplify3D. I'll show you that a little bit later, but for now, let's just show you that this is where you would turn it on and where you would mess with those settings. As far as temperature goes, you'll have a temperature controller for each particular nozzle, or if you had a heated build plate, that would be on the list here. And you can change the temperature down here, so these other settings not super important. But you can see here from layer 1, right here, and every layer after that, it's going to try and set the temperature to 230 degrees centigrade, which is what I like to print out on my MakerBot Replicator too. Excuse me. If you wanted to change temperatures at some point throughout the print, you can add more set points here, but that's more complicated and not super worth going over right now. In general, having layer 1 and then whatever your temperature is should set the printer to preheat to that setting and then keep that temperature for the rest of the print. So this is where you change the temperature of your print. The cooling tab, again, is not super duper important at all. The only thing that I would draw your attention to is the overrides. If you're trying to print something that's small, Simplify3D may decide that it's not giving your filament enough time to cool down before the nozzle passes back over that same point of your print. And so it's worthwhile potentially to slow down the print so that it has more time to cool. I've noticed that the defaults for this are typically a little bit overzealous in slowing down your print. For example, making sure that, or trying to make sure that all your prints, each layer is 15 seconds, can make your print run really, really slowly. So, for example, here at Dice3D, we tried to print little tiny souvenirs, and they've run for maybe 3 times as long as they should have, because Simplify3D tried to slow them down. So if you're having a small print, you may want to try messing with these settings, or even turning it off altogether. Moving along, the G-code tab has a lot of fancy stuff. This almost all has to do with setting up a new printer, so you won't need to mess with it. The scripts tab is similar. This is stuff to add to the beginning or the end of your print, and is not important at all unless you're setting up a new printer. The other tab does have some useful stuff. This is where the speeds come into play. So the default printing speed for me is, this will either be in millimeters per second or millimeters per minute. I know that they like to use millimeters per minute as the default, but if you've used MakerBot Desktop, then you've probably gotten used to millimeters per second. If you can use millimeters per minute, it's better to get used to those because they're better, but I'm stuck using millimeters per second. But for me, 90 millimeters per second or 100 for default printing speed, how fast your nozzle's moving while it's printing. We like to have that a little bit lower than maximum speed because that keeps it a little bit higher quality. So 90 for me on the Replicator 2 is usually pretty good. The outline underspeed is how much slower the final outline is going to be. And that's a percentage of your normal printing speed. I usually like to keep that 70, maybe 50%. Keeps things looking pretty nice on the outside when you care more about how it looks rather than the speed. Solid infill I typically don't mess with, but it's just like the tops and the bottoms will make them look better. And support structure speed is just to make sure they print really, really well. I don't mess with that either typically. XY axis movement speed is how fast you're moving when you're not pushing filament. This is typically set closer to the maximum for your particular printer. So if your printer can go at 150 millimeters per second, you don't really care about how it's going to look while it's doing that. You just care that it gets to where it's going as fast as possible. And the Z-axis speed you can tweak as much as possible. This is the same thing, but vertically instead of left and right. The rest of these settings are more complicated and not super important for what we're talking about. And as you could probably imagine, the Advanced tab here is not super important either for any particular print that you want to do. So I'll leave all of this open for another video. But now that I've changed those settings, I'm actually going to say, let's go and get ready to print. So to slice your file, actually, you'll go down here to the Prepare to Print button and click that. And it'll take a little while, but if you're used to MakerBot, you'll notice that it goes way faster than MakerBot. This video would be much, much longer of me just waiting. Maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes to get this particularly exciting and very difficult to slice model to slice in MakerBot, but you can see Simplify does it in maybe 30 or 50 seconds, which is pretty awesome. So it's generated supports for my model. I've got all these supports everywhere, which I can tell you firsthand is a huge pain in the butt to take off, but this is a complicated model. There's not a whole lot you can do about that. And it's done a pretty good job with that. I also, since I turned on the raft down here, you can see this is what the raft looks like. And the colors are all relative to the speed, so the raft will go much slower than some of your other parts of your print. But everything looks good. There's no big problems with like holes on the outside of my print or anything like that. To see on the inside, you can go down here and preview parts of your print. So this will let me scroll down through my print and see what it looks like on the inside. And this is the infill pattern right here. But again, there's no nothing weird going on here because I typically make sure that my prints look good before I try to print them. But you may see some weird stuff, in which case you might want to have to go and repair your print, potentially using NetFab or something like that. But everything looks good here. You'll also notice at the top here, this is that cooling bit where the top parts will go try and slow them down as much as possible so that they have enough time to cool down. Here I'd say that's pretty important because otherwise this can get kind of wobbly and look really ugly. But like if your whole print is that size, then it may matter less to you. That's personal preference. It's something you'll just have to get used to. But there's also a couple parts here where, like, okay, I wish that some of my parts of my print had supports that don't. So, for example, right here, it's a little bit hard to see, but this tentacle is not actually touching the ground. And it has no support, so that's going to look really, really bad. And I would prefer if my earpiece didn't have a broken tentacle on the ground. Now, this is one of the best features of Simplify, which is why I'm taking time to show it to you right now, is that you can manually define where you want your supports to go. To do that, you'll actually exit this preview mode and get back to your model by clicking that button down there. Now, to see where it wants to put those supports, you can have it auto-generate supports by either going to Tools and manually define supports for model, or going over here to the right and clicking this manually define supports button here. I like this one. This will open up the support generation tab. This is super duper useful, which will show you exactly where the model wants to, where Simplify wants to put supports for you, based off of how big the minimum size of your printer, minimum size of your supports are, and the overhang percentage, or the angle that will trigger supports and everything over that angle. So 45 degrees, if you go any more than that, then it will start to get supports. I think that's right. Or sorry, less than that. So to see these values, you click the Apply Based on Overhang Angle, and it'll show me all these boxes of where the supports are going to be placed. And as we saw before, they're pretty good with where they're going. This isn't the exact tool path, so like supports that are right next to each other will be combined into like single lines and such like that. But it gives you an idea of what is or isn't going to be supported. To see also parts that may need to be supported, I'd like to look at it from the bottom. And so like for example, you can see that like this part is like some little prick, little hair bit on the bottom that isn't going to be supported. So that's also something that we'll need to add supports to. So in order to do that, we'll click the Add New Supports button, and now when I'm looking at my print, it'll show where it's going to add a support if I left-click. The only thing that's kind of annoying about that is you still need to rotate by left-clicking, and if you left-click while touching your print, it will add a support there before starting to rotate. So just be mindful of that. That means I usually left-click somewhere way off of my model in order to make sure to rotate it. So let's fix this tentacle over here that we knew had an issue. To do that, just mouse under the bottom of it, and you see it's proposing a support there, and I just left-click to add it. Great, so that tentacle should now work, which is pretty nice. These teeth look like they also need support, so I'll add a couple there. You can also see supports can start from on top of, say, this tentacle, and say help support this other tentacle, whiskers, teeth, whatever you want to call them. Make sure that this will print nicely. So I'll add a couple more here. Excellent. And I had said that there was this little hair bit or muscle ripple, I guess, I don't even know, over here. So I'll add some under here. But just about everything else looks good. You'll probably want to do a more in-depth inspection of your print. I don't care too much because I'm actually not going to print this right now. But since you've got all of that set up, you can just say done. If there was a support where you said, I don't actually care about that, for example, a good place that I just learned recently is inside of his mouth. It's going to be very, 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 very hard to take the supports out. So to fix that, you can say remove existing supports and delete these by left-clicking on them. So now I care less about how the inside of this mouth looks. If it droops a little bit, which is want to do for parts that typically need supports, I don't care too much. So I'll remove everything that's in there, and instead just place them on the outermost part where I might actually be able to get the supports off, and the parts that I care about the most, like these teeth. So for a print like this, I'll add one on like each tooth, for example, more or less, and like that. That way I can actually pull these supports off, and the inside of the mouth will still look good without having tons of supports in there that I can't get out. That's a pretty simple trick that I found recently. For the rest of this, though, I'd say I look pretty good. If I decided that I didn't need some supports in here, I might get rid of them, but whatever. That's really up to your particular model, and you may not even have support, so I'm just wasting your time. So let's get going. Before I do the final slice, I should also mention that depending on what type of printer you're using, you do need to make sure that Simplify knows the firmware that it's using. For example, MakerBot printers like to use different commands than any other printer because they're special. So to make sure you're slicing for the right type of printer, you'll go up to this Tools tab here and click the Firmware Configuration. I always do this because the club here at Dice3D has printers of both MakerBots and non-MakerBots, so it's always important for me to make sure that I'm slicing for the right type. So these are really, really, really advanced settings. You almost will never need to change these except for this Select Profile thing up here. If this says Rep Wrap, that means you're slicing for any printer that's not a MakerBot. MakerBots get their own thing that says MakerBot or Sailfish. If you click that on the MakerBot, then you're all set to go. Rep wraps are pretty universal. It does not matter what type of rep wrap printer you're using. They will all use the other settings. If you're using a MakerBot, you do also need to tell it what type of MakerBot, because MakerBots are kind of dumb and don't know how big they are. To change that, you go to this X3G tab right here and tell it what type of profile, what type of machine you're using. So in this case, I am using a MakerBot Replicator 2. But if I was using, say, Replicator 1 or some clone of the Rep 1, I would need to change that. So that goes for something like the FlashForge Creator X or the Power Spec. Those are clones of MakerBot printers, so they also need this setting here. If you don't do this, then you'll get slightly missized prints, which typically isn't a problem unless you're doing stuff that needs to be mechanically accurate. Then you'll pull your hair out when it doesn't fit, when the models say they're the right size. It's a huge pain in the butt, so learn from my mistakes. So let's slice this again. Click the Prepare to Print thing, and we'll be all set to go. So we're basically done at this point. There's nothing else really to change as far as settings go, and you should have messed with everything that needed to happen. So once this is done slicing, I'll just show you the final statistics of our print. Right up here will show you how long it's going to take, the amount of filament you're going to use, the weight of filament, and the cost if you put in the amount your spool costs as a whole. This is a general estimate. I found that the build times typically are longer than what Simplify will ask for. Whether that's a bug in the software or a setting I haven't messed with properly, I don't know yet, so just be wary. If it says 6 hours and 28 minutes, it may be longer. I've seen prints that are twice as long as what Simplify estimates, but hopefully that will get fixed soon, or I will fix it in my settings. And then if you want to print over USB, if you're plugged into your printer, you can print via USB there, and use the machine control panel, which I don't know enough about to using, so I won't show it to you right now. Maybe at a future update. Another video. But typically what I do is I'll print from USB, from an SD card. So to save it onto an SD card, I'll say Save Toolpath to Disk, and it'll give me a directory and I can save it whatever I want. You should also notice if you're using a MakerBot printer, you may be used to using X3G file formats rather than G-code. Don't worry about that. It will save, Simplify3D will save both a G-code file format and X3G. The only thing that's important about that is you need to make sure you're not overwriting another file, because it will only overwrite the G-code and not the X3G, so you'll be printing with the old X3G file. And so if your print had failed and you're changing settings to fix it, it will fail again in the same way, which is a huge pain in the butt. You don't want that to happen. Then you just say save. This will say previewing file and probably become unresponsive depending on how important or how difficult it is to save your slice. So just give it a second. If it says it's become unresponsive and do you want to kill it, if Windows tells you that, then you just say, no, I'll just wait. It'll take a little while. After it says, toolpath successfully exported to wherever you had it, then you should be all set. If you're slicing for a MakerBot, it may also say running GPX add-on or whatever. Just let that run also to make sure your file is all set. Then copy it onto your SD card or slice directly to your SD card, whatever you want, and you should be all set. So that's everything you need to do to slice from Simplify3D onto an SD card for any given printer. If you have any particular questions or comments, you can let me know in the comments, or send me an email or something like that. If not, happy printing, and hopefully I'll be doing another video for all of the settings that I glossed over today. And I think this should be good for the most recent version of Simplify3D as of right now. But if things change, I'll be sure to let you guys know, or you can ask me if you have any other questions. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoy using Simplify3D. I definitely think it's the best thing for slicing complex models like this guy, given any printer, even for MakerBots or something like that. And it does a much faster job and a much nicer job, I think, of generating supports, rafts, everything like that. So I'll let you guys know if I'm going to be doing another video, and hope this helped you and enjoy. So happy printing, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.